It was an early morning in Washington, D.C. The sky was painted in soft hues of orange and pink as the city slowly came to life. Inside Reagan National Airport, travelers bustled about, clutching their morning coffees and rolling their suitcases across the tiled floor. Among them was 21-year-old Sasha Obama, navigating her way through the crowd with quiet determination. She wasn't just another traveler. She was on her way to Los Angeles to present her research at a prestigious youth conference, a milestone moment in her academic journey. Though she was the daughter of a former president, she had worked hard to make a name for herself beyond the shadow of her famous family. This conference was proof of that. As she adjusted her backpack and checked the time on her phone, just past 6:30 a.m., she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Sasha approached the check-in counter, holding her ticket and ID, offering a polite greeting to the airline employee behind the desk. The woman, whose name tag read M. Reynolds, barely looked up before taking the documents from her hand. Her eyes flicked over the ticket, then back to Sasha, her brows drawing together slightly. "Flying business class?" she asked, her tone laced with skepticism. "Yes," Sasha replied confidently. A long silence stretched between them as Reynolds inspected the ticket, as if searching for an error. Then she called over a colleague, whispering something while glancing toward Sasha. The second agent, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, took the ID and examined it with exaggerated care. "This ticket is for business class," he stated. Sasha maintained her composure. "I know. It's mine." The man exchanged a look with Reynolds before reluctantly handing the ticket back. "Fine. Go ahead," he muttered, waving her through as if she were a nuisance rather than a paying passenger. She took her documents, her jaw tightening, but she refused to let them see they had rattled her. Sasha made her way to the security checkpoint, determined to put the awkward exchange behind her. The line moved steadily, passengers shuffling forward in small bursts. TSA agents barked instructions, guiding people through the process. She placed her backpack on the conveyor belt and stepped through the metal detector without issue. But just as she reached for her bag on the other side, a TSA agent stepped in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his expression unreadable. "We need to perform a secondary screening." Sasha frowned. "Why?" "It's just a random check," he replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. Before she could argue, another agent gestured for her to step aside. What followed was an excessive and invasive search. She was patted down thoroughly. Her belongings were rummaged through, and her laptop was opened and inspected. "Who purchased your ticket?" one agent asked, holding up her boarding pass as if it were suspicious. "I did," she answered, her patience wearing thin. "Business class, huh?" The agent smirked, her face flushed with irritation, but she held her tongue. She knew better than to escalate the situation. After what felt like an eternity, they handed her bag back. "You're good to go," one agent said dismissively. She took her things and walked away, shaken but determined not to let this ruin her morning. Sasha quickened her pace toward her departure gate, glancing at her watch. Less than an hour until takeoff. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the discomfort from security. But as she approached the boarding area, she noticed a small group of airline staff, whispering among themselves. Their eyes flicked toward her before one of them, a middle-aged woman with a rigid demeanor, stepped forward. "Miss, I need to see your ticket and ID again," the woman said, her voice devoid of warmth. Sasha sighed but complied. The woman scanned the documents, then said, "There's an issue with your ticket. Please come with me." Her patience snapped. "What kind of issue?" "It's just a routine verification," the woman replied, already walking toward a side corridor. Sasha hesitated. Something felt off, but she followed. Her heart pounded as she realized they were walking away from the bustling gate area into a quiet corridor marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The woman stopped abruptly and turned to face her. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow you to board this flight," she said, her tone cold and final. You'll need to leave the airport. Sasha stared at her, stunned. What? Why? We have our reasons. Fury surged through Sasha. This is unacceptable. I've done nothing wrong. The woman folded her arms. If you don't leave willingly, security will escort you out. Sasha clenched her fists, humiliation and anger rising inside her. But she refused to let them see her break. She pulled out her phone and called the one person who would make this right. Dad, I need you. Barack Obama's calm, steady voice came through the line. I'm on my way. She stood alone in the silent corridor, her heart pounding. The minutes felt endless. Then she heard footsteps, firm, deliberate. She looked up and saw him. Barack Obama strode toward her with the quiet authority of a man who had spent years commanding respect. The staff stiffened, their expressions shifting from indifference to unease. The airline manager cleared her throat. Mr. Obama, we had concerns regarding your daughter's behavior. Barack raised an eyebrow. Concerns? His voice was controlled but sharp. She was flagged. Someone began. For what? Barack asked. She had a valid ticket, valid ID, and was prepared to board. What exactly was the problem? Silence. The employees exchanged nervous glances. Barack's tone hardened. Here's what's going to happen. I want a full explanation, immediate accountability, and guarantees that this will never happen again. Within hours, the incident made its way to top officials. The staff involved were placed on administrative leave, and an internal investigation was launched. But the story didn't end there. Sasha used the experience to speak out, bringing attention to bias in the airline industry. Her speech at the conference became a rallying call for change. This isn't just about me, she said to a packed audience. It's about everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. And it's about making sure this never happens again. Her father watched from the crowd, his face unreadable. But he knew this wasn't just an incident to move past. It was a moment that would change things forever. As the days passed, the incident at Reagan National Airport sent shockwaves through the media. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail of what had happened to Sasha Obama that morning. The public reaction was swift. While some were outraged at the blatant discrimination, others dismissed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But for Sasha, it was more than just an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper issue. Determined to ensure this didn't fade into just another forgotten news cycle, she took to social media, sharing her experience in her own words. She described the way she had been treated differently, the doubts cast on her legitimacy as a business-class passenger, the unwarranted additional screenings, and the humiliating final rejection at the gate. Her post quickly went viral, sparking a national conversation about racial profiling, implicit bias, and the need for accountability in airport security and airline policies. But words alone weren't enough. Within days, calls for action grew louder. The TSA and the airline involved were forced to issue formal statements, acknowledging the incident and launching internal investigations. Advocacy groups stepped in, urging reforms to prevent similar cases from happening again. Meanwhile, Sasha continued using her platform to elevate the voices of others who had faced similar injustices, proving that what happened to her was not an isolated event. Her father, Barack Obama, stood by her side, not just as a former president, but as a father who refused to let his daughter be silenced. Behind the scenes, he pushed for policy changes, calling for better training in bias detection and increased oversight on security procedures. He knew that the fight for fairness and equality wasn't new, but this time it had a very personal face. For Sasha, the moment had changed her. What started as a morning of quiet determination had turned into a defining moment. She had refused to be dismissed, demanded accountability, and used her voice to spark real change. And as she looked ahead, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. In the weeks following the incident, the conversation refused to die down. Major news networks invited experts to discuss racial bias in air travel, and activists called for greater transparency in TSA procedures. The airline involved faced public scrutiny, with travelers sharing their own experiences of being unfairly targeted. What happened to Sasha Obama was no longer just her story. It had become a catalyst for a larger movement. University students, civil rights organizations, and public figures voiced their support, some even organizing protests at major airports, demanding change. Airlines scrambled to review their diversity training programs, and the TSA announced an internal audit of its screening policies. But for Sasha, the real victory wasn't in press statements or corporate apologies. It was in the people who felt seen because of what she had gone through. One evening, as she sat on the balcony of her family's home, looking out over the Washington skyline, her father joined her, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "You handled this with strength," Barack said, his voice calm but proud. Sasha exhaled, still holding on to the weight of it all. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place." He nodded. "No, it shouldn't have. But change doesn't happen unless someone calls it out." She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think things will actually change?" He took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Change is slow, but every step forward matters." As she looked out over the city, she realized that morning at the airport had done something unexpected. It had given her a new sense of purpose. What was meant to silence her had only made her voice louder, and she wasn't planning on stopping anytime soon. As the days passed, the incident at Reagan National Airport sent shockwaves through the media. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every detail of what had happened to Sasha Obama that morning. The public reaction was swift. While some were outraged at the blatant discrimination, others dismissed it as an unfortunate misunderstanding. But for Sasha, it was more than just an isolated event. It was a symptom of a deeper issue. Determined to ensure this didn't fade into just another forgotten news cycle, she took to social media, sharing her experience in her own words. She described the way she had been treated differently, the doubts cast on her legitimacy as a business-class passenger, the unwarranted additional screenings, and the humiliating final rejection at the gate. Her post quickly went viral, sparking a national conversation about racial profiling, implicit bias, and the need for accountability in airport security and airline policies. But words alone weren't enough. Within days, calls for action grew louder. The TSA and the airline involved were forced to issue formal statements, acknowledging the incident and launching internal investigations. Advocacy groups stepped in, urging reforms to prevent similar cases from happening again. Meanwhile, Sasha continued using her platform to elevate the voices of others who had faced similar injustices, proving that what happened to her was not an isolated event. Her father, Barack Obama, stood by her side, not just as a former president, but as a father who refused to let his daughter be silenced. Behind the scenes, he pushed for policy changes, calling for better training in bias detection and increased oversight on security procedures. He knew that the fight for fairness and equality wasn't new, but this time it had a very personal face. For Sasha, the moment had changed her. What started as a morning of quiet determination had turned into a defining moment. She had refused to be dismissed, demanded accountability, and used her voice to spark real change. And as she looked ahead, she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Sasha had always been aware of the privilege and challenges that came with her last name, but that morning at Reagan National Airport had stripped away any illusion that she could move through the world without being judged by assumptions rather than facts. It wasn't just about missing a flight. It was about the message they had sent her, that even with her achievements, her education, and her background, there were still places where people didn't believe she belonged. But instead of letting the experience diminish her confidence, she used it to fuel her determination. As she prepared for her speech at the youth conference in Los Angeles, she rewrote her opening lines, not just about her research, but about what had happened at the airport. She refused to stay silent. Standing in front of a packed auditorium, She recounted the events of that morning, not as a story of victimhood, but as a call to action. "This isn't just about me," she told the audience, her voice steady. "It's about anyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. It's about a system that allows prejudice to dictate how people are treated. And it's about the change we must demand." The room erupted in applause, not just because of who she was, but because she had spoken a truth so many had experienced. That day, Sasha realized that her voice carried more weight than she had ever imagined, not because of her father's legacy, but because of the fire within her to make a difference. After the conference in Los Angeles, Sasha found herself at the center of a much larger conversation. The incident at Reagan National Airport wasn't just a personal ordeal anymore. It had become a public example of the biases many people face in everyday life. Messages flooded her inbox from strangers who had gone through similar humiliations at airports, hotels, restaurants, and workplaces. Some recounted being questioned for no reason, while others described being treated like outsiders despite having every right to be where they were. Sasha took it all in. She read each message, realizing that what had happened to her was only a small piece of a much bigger problem. But rather than feeling overwhelmed, she felt empowered. She had a platform, one that she could use to make sure these stories were heard, acknowledged, and acted upon. She started sharing these experiences on social media, not just as isolated events, but as evidence of a system that needed to change. She spoke about how bias isn't always loud or obvious. It's often subtle, hidden behind rules and procedures that allow people to be treated unfairly under the guise of policy or security. The response was explosive. Advocacy groups picked up her words, activists amplified them, and suddenly, major organizations were forced to respond. The TSA issued a statement saying they were reviewing their screening protocols to prevent discriminatory practices. The airline involved faced significant backlash, prompting them to update their employee training. And most importantly, people, ordinary travelers who had once felt powerless, began to speak out about their own experiences. But for Sasha, the fight wasn't just about fixing one airport's mistake. It was about dismantling an entire way of thinking, one that allowed people to be judged by their appearance rather than their actions. She started working with civil rights groups, attending meetings with airline executives, and pushing for real policy changes. Her father, though deeply familiar with the long road of change, supported her fully. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sat with Barack on the balcony of their family home in Washington, D.C. The city lights stretched out before them, the air thick with summer warmth. "You know," Barack said, taking a sip of his tea, "I've spent my whole life fighting for change. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that real progress doesn't happen overnight." Sasha sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I just don't want this to be another viral story that fades away." Her father turned to her, his expression serious. "Then don't let it." She looked at him, absorbing the weight of his words. Change wasn't something you waited for. It was something you fought for, over and over again. The incident at the airport had started as a moment of frustration and humiliation, but it had transformed into something greater. It had given Sasha a mission, not just to speak out for herself, but for everyone who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. And as she sat there, the city humming quietly in the distance, she knew this was only the beginning. In the days and weeks that followed the airport incident, Sasha found herself grappling with a mix of emotions. The outrage she had felt that morning at Reagan National Airport hadn't faded. It had evolved. It wasn't just about her own experience anymore. It was about the thousands of people who had faced similar injustices, but had never been given the chance to speak up. The media continued to cover the story, but Sasha knew that viral headlines had a short lifespan. If real change was going to happen, it had to be more than just a trending topic. It had to turn into action. She started meeting with legal experts, activists, and community leaders to discuss the systemic issues behind racial profiling in air travel. She learned how policies that were meant to ensure security were often used as a cover for biased treatment. Certain passengers, particularly people of color, were more likely to be flagged for random security checks, questioned about their travel plans, or treated with suspicion for no valid reason. Sasha knew this wasn't just about her. It was about a system that had been in place for far too long. One afternoon, she sat in a meeting with members of the ACLU and NAACP, listening to travelers share their personal stories. A black businessman recounted how he was stopped at the airport nearly every time he traveled, despite being a frequent flyer with top-tier status. A Latina mother tearfully shared how she and her young children were pulled aside for additional screening, treated as if they were a threat rather than a family going on vacation. Each story fueled Sasha's determination. She wasn't just going to raise awareness. She was going to demand real policy changes. Taking the fight to Congress, with the help of civil rights attorneys and advocacy groups, Sasha began drafting proposals for changes in how airports and airlines handled passenger screenings, security checks, and bias training. The goal wasn't to weaken security. It was to ensure that no one was unfairly targeted based on their race, ethnicity, or appearance. Soon, Sasha was invited to Capitol Hill, where she met with senators and representatives who had been pushing for similar reforms. Some were eager to support her efforts, recognizing that racial profiling in air travel was a long-standing issue that needed attention. Others were hesitant, dismissing her concerns as isolated incidents rather than a widespread problem. But Sasha refused to back down. She testified before a congressional committee, sharing her experience and the countless stories she had collected. Her voice was steady, her words precise, and her determination unwavering. This isn't about one flight. This isn't about one airport. This is about a culture of bias that needs to change, she told the committee. We cannot continue to allow people to be treated differently just because of how they look or who they are. Her testimony made waves. News networks aired clips of her speech, social media exploded with support, and lawmakers began drafting new legislation aimed at increasing accountability in TSA procedures and requiring implicit bias training for all airport staff. The airline industry was now feeling the pressure. CEOs from major U.S. airlines were called to address the issue, forced to answer difficult questions about how their policies contributed to racial disparities in passenger treatment. Some denied wrongdoing, while others admitted that change was overdue. But Sasha wasn't done yet. The White House meeting. One of the biggest turning points came when Sasha was invited to the White House to discuss the issue directly with administration officials. While she had grown up around politics and power, this time was different. She wasn't there as the daughter of a former president. She was there as an advocate for justice, sitting in a high-level meeting with government officials, airline executives, and TSA leadership. Sasha didn't hesitate to speak her mind. You can put out statements. You can hold press conferences. But none of that matters if policies don't change. If training isn't mandatory, if accountability isn't real. Some executives nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to being challenged so directly. But Sasha had learned something from her father. Powerful change never comes from staying silent. A legacy of change. In the following months, significant reforms were introduced. The TSA implemented mandatory anti-bias training. Airlines committed to reviewing and improving their passenger screening procedures, and a federal oversight board was created to track and investigate discrimination complaints in air travel. For the first time in decades, real progress was being made. But for Sasha, it wasn't just about the policies. It was about the people, the travelers who had been made to feel less than, the families who had been treated with suspicion instead of respect, the young girls like herself who had been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. She knew that one fight wouldn't fix everything, that racism and bias were too deeply embedded to be erased overnight. But she also knew this. The morning she had been kicked out of Reagan National Airport, they had expected her to leave quietly. They had expected her to accept it, to move on, to let it go. Instead, she had turned their injustice into a movement. She had spoken up, and the world had listened. And that, she realized, was how real change had always begun. As months passed, the impact of what had happened to Sasha Obama at Reagan National Airport continued to grow. What started as a humiliating personal experience had transformed into a national movement for fair treatment in air travel. More travelers, public figures, and civil rights organizations joined the conversation, exposing long-standing issues of racial profiling, implicit bias, and discrimination in security screenings. But Sasha knew that change didn't just happen in news headlines or through corporate statements. It had to be cemented in policies and practices that could not be ignored or reversed. Determined to turn awareness into lasting reform, she worked alongside lawmakers, legal experts, and activists to create concrete solutions. She attended roundtable discussions with aviation executives, met with airport security officials, and participated in public forums to hear firsthand accounts from passengers who had experienced the same kind of treatment. One thing became clear: this was bigger than just airports. Bias and discrimination were deeply embedded in many aspects of daily life, from job interviews to hotel check-ins, from banking to real estate. The airport incident was simply one example of how individuals were unfairly judged, questioned, and denied access based on perceptions rather than facts. Sasha understood that fighting for fairness in air travel was just the first step. As the movement grew in the United States, international attention followed. News outlets from Europe, Africa, and Asia picked up the story, highlighting how racial bias affected air travel in different parts of the world. Stories surfaced from Black travelers in Europe who had been disproportionately stopped at border checkpoints. Middle Eastern passengers shared experiences of being subjected to excessive scrutiny even when flying for business or family reasons. Activists in Canada and the UK called for similar investigations into their aviation industries, questioning whether so-called random checks were actually based on unspoken prejudices. Sasha received invitations to speak at international human rights conferences, where she met lawyers, professors, and civil rights leaders who had been studying this issue for years. She learned about cases where people had sued airlines for wrongful treatment, some winning settlements, but others facing long legal battles that rarely led to systemic change. The more she listened, the more she realized that her experience was not unique. It was part of a global pattern that needed to be addressed at every level. In Washington, the momentum reached Congress once again. The pressure from advocacy groups, combined with Sasha's continued work, resulted in a landmark bill aimed at preventing discrimination in air travel. The proposed legislation included stronger oversight of TSA practices, requiring detailed reports on how passengers were selected for additional screenings, mandatory anti-bias training for all airport and airline employees, a formal complaint system, making it easier for passengers to report and challenge unfair treatment, accountability measures, ensuring that repeated violations led to fines and penalties for airlines or security teams engaging in discriminatory practices. When the bill was brought to the floor for debate, it faced some resistance from lawmakers who downplayed the issue. Some dismissed the concerns, claiming that security procedures should not be changed for the sake of political correctness. But Sasha wasn't about to let the fight be derailed. She testified before Congress once more, this time bringing passengers, legal experts, and former TSA employees to share their own experiences. With facts, data, and undeniable stories, she made the case for why this legislation was not just about one airport or one incident. It was about fairness, dignity, and fundamental rights. After months of debate, the bill was finally passed, marking a historic step toward reducing discrimination in air travel. For Sasha, it was a moment of victory, but she knew the work was far from over. Months after the incident at Reagan National Airport, Sasha Obama had transformed from an unwilling participant in an act of injustice to a leading voice in the fight against systemic bias in air travel. But as her advocacy gained traction, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about airports. The patterns of discrimination she had exposed in the aviation industry were mirrored in countless other spaces: schools, workplaces, financial institutions, even public transportation. The fight for fair treatment wasn't limited to one location. It was woven into the fabric of society, and Sasha was determined to pull at the threads until something unraveled. She launched an initiative called Travel Without Fear, an organization focused on tracking, exposing, and eliminating discriminatory practices in transportation, security, and hospitality services. The initiative allowed travelers to report instances of unfair treatment, creating a database of complaints that could be analyzed for trends and systemic biases. Within weeks, the initiative revealed shocking statistics. Black and Latino travelers were significantly more likely to be selected for random screenings. Women of color frequently reported being questioned about their travel plans in ways their white counterparts were not. Passengers with Middle Eastern names were flagged at a disproportionately high rate, even when holding elite traveler status with airlines. Armed with this data-driven evidence, Sasha's initiative began working alongside lawmakers, corporate leaders, and international human rights groups to demand greater accountability and transparency in travel policies. The impact was immediate. Airlines that had long dismissed discrimination complaints as misunderstandings were now forced to confront undeniable patterns of bias. Government agencies were being pressured to reform security procedures, and major corporations in hospitality and travel started revising their employee training programs to address implicit bias. Sasha was no longer just a voice in the conversation. She was leading it. As her work expanded, Sasha received an invitation that took her by surprise, a meeting with executives from one of the largest airline alliances in the world. The very industry that had once dismissed concerns about discrimination was now seeking her input on how to rebuild trust with marginalized communities. Walking into a boardroom filled with CEOs, security directors, and corporate lawyers, Sasha knew the stakes were high. These were people who had billions of dollars at their disposal, but what they lacked was a lived experience of being treated as less than in their own airports. One executive spoke first. "We know there's a problem, but we don't know how to fix it," he admitted. "We need your help." Sasha took a deep breath. "Fixing it starts with admitting how deep the problem goes," she said firmly. "It's not about putting out PR-friendly diversity campaigns. It's about dismantling the systems that let bias thrive in the first place." For the next 2 hours, she outlined a clear, actionable strategy. Create an independent oversight board to review discrimination complaints against airline staff and security personnel. Introduce mandatory anti-bias training, not just for frontline employees, but for corporate leadership as well. Use technology to track passenger treatment, ensuring that no group is disproportionately selected for extra screenings. Launch an accountability system where incidents of bias would lead to real consequences, not just internal warnings, but financial penalties and legal investigations. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others took notes furiously. By the end of the meeting, Sasha had secured a groundbreaking partnership. The airline alliance agreed to implement several of her proposals, making it the first major step toward lasting industry-wide change. The press hailed the agreement as a landmark moment. News anchors debated whether Sasha had just forced the airline industry into its biggest reckoning since post-9/11 security reforms. But for Sasha, this wasn't about headlines. It was about ensuring that what happened to her would never happen to another traveler again. With every movement for progress comes resistance, and Sasha quickly learned that not everyone wanted to see her succeed. As her initiative gained global attention, so did the criticism. Some conservative media outlets painted her as an entitled celebrity activist, accusing her of exaggerating her experience for political gain. One well-known commentator went as far as to say, "This is just another case of someone playing the victim. Airport security is necessary for safety. Maybe if she weren't so privileged, she'd understand that." The online harassment escalated. Trolls flooded her social media accounts with hateful messages, calling her soft for speaking out, mocking her for standing up against discrimination, and even sending death threats. But Sasha refused to be intimidated. She responded with a single, powerful message. Speaking out against injustice isn't weakness. Staying silent in the face of it is. Her words went viral. igniting a wave of support from public figures, activists, and everyday travelers who had faced similar treatment. She knew that the more they tried to silence her, the more proof she had that she was making an impact. By the time Sasha turned 25, her work had reshaped how airlines and security agencies handled bias in passenger screenings. The legislation she had helped push forward was now law, and Travel Without Fear had expanded beyond the U.S., creating global partnerships with travel agencies, airlines, and international security organizations. One evening, as she sat at a cafe in Los Angeles, preparing for another meeting with lawmakers, a woman approached her hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "Because of what you did, I don't have to explain to my son why he keeps getting stopped at the airport just for being who he is." Sasha felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent years fighting for this moment, a moment where someone else didn't have to experience what she had. As the woman walked away, Sasha pulled out her phone. She had a message from her father, Barack Obama. "Proud of you." She smiled. The morning she had been kicked out of Reagan National Airport, she had been made to feel small and powerless. But now, she had changed the industry, changed the conversation, and most importantly, changed lives. And she wasn't done yet.